Last week we looked at several in a row, all of which were not important. 2 weeks ago we were spending our whole time with one, Worrell's New Testament, not because the translation is that important, but because the notes are interesting. And so this morning we're going to spend all of our time again with a single translation. This will kind of characterize, I think, a lot of our study, going back and forth between several translations that are not that important, and which can therefore be all placed together, generally in the same message, if they're around the same period of time, and translations that are important and that necessitate a little longer study individually on them. So number 13 is entitled, The Bible, a New Translation. The Bible, a New Translation. And the date is 1928. Number 12 was Concordant Version, 1926. But it's best known after its author's name, the Moffatt Bible. The Moffatt Bible, which looks like this, if you want to look up here while you're writing. Now, it should be fairly easy to take notes this morning because I have it broken up the way we're going to discuss Moffatt's Bible. So under 13, I guess big letter A would be, first of all, let's discuss the man, James Moffatt. Some of you have said that you have Moffatt's Bible. And we're going to look at, and if you don't have it, we're going to need your KJV, because we're going to look at a lot of passages here in a moment, and we'll be able to use this time not only to study Moffatt's Bible, and more specifically what's wrong with Moffatt's translation, but you can learn some other things in the process. Well, let's start with a little discussion of the man, James Moffatt. He was born in 1870, died in 1944. And he was a Scottish scholar. Now, a lot of these men, or several of these early men, are Scots for some reason. They come from Scotland. He was a Scottish scholar, an author of many, many books, but he's best remembered because of his New Testament. Now, we have a whole Bible, the Bible, a new translation, but the first part of that was the New Testament, a new translation. Now, he did some work and some study in Glasgow, Scotland, and here he was influenced by the famous commentator A.B. Bruce. A.B. Bruce. Now, he was influenced by Bruce. Bruce was somewhat of a conservative. And I guess the reason I mention this, well, this is the book that made A.B. Bruce famous. One of the first books I bought in my library, entitled The Training of the 12, which is kind of like a 600-page discussion of Jesus and the relation he had with the 12 apostles. What were his techniques in training these men and preparing them to take Christianity to the world? For instance, the little blurb here on the front of it, how Jesus, the master trainer, prepared his tiny band of followers to win the world with faith and love. Next to the Bible itself, this classic book can be every Christian leader's most important resource. I don't know that you get a whole lot out of it, but it is kind of a classic on the subject. It's a devotional type book. That's what I mean by the fact that maybe you won't get a lot out of it, because it's just his thoughts, devotional thoughts on how Jesus prepared those men, the training of the 12. And the only reason I'm really mentioning that, I wouldn't otherwise, not in this context, is because of a story that F.F. Bruce has often told about A.B. Bruce in this book, The Training of the 12. Now, most of you are familiar, I think, with F.F. Bruce. He's much better known, A, because he's written many more books than did A.B. Bruce, and B, and more importantly, because F.F. Bruce is still alive today. Barely. He's about 75 or 80 now, but he is still alive today. And he tells in his autobiography in hardback entitled In Retrospect that on one occasion, and I'm sure it's happened on more occasions than one, back in his younger days, he was traveling, speaking in a certain area, and after he finished with his lecture, then he would greet people at the door, and a woman came up to him, and and said, well, I really enjoyed your message this morning. And she said, and also, we really love your book, The Training of the 12. Well, of course, this was written in 1871, this book here. And that's happened to F.F. Bruce many times, and he said, boy, it really humbled me, made me feel my age. He was a young man then. You know, how could he have written it back in 1871? So I've never forgotten. I've owned this book long before I ever heard F.F. Bruce tell that story, but I've never forgotten it now in connection. People, I guess, whenever they don't really know what they're talking about, often confuse F.F. Bruce with A.B. Bruce, but there's about 100 years difference between the two. It's very humbling, and it does a disservice to F.F. Bruce when you remind him how much you liked his book, The Training of the 12. Well, anyway, Moffatt was influenced, however, by this man, A.B. Bruce, The Training of the 12. He, first of all, Moffatt was involved in pastoral work in Scotland. And after that, this happens often, like it happened to Karl Barth and others, after involving themselves in pastoral work for a short period of time. Then Moffatt moved on into the schools, where he stayed for the remainder of his productive life. Of course, Barth started off as pastor, and just was not satisfied with the literature that he had available to himself to teach his people from, and that sent him to the universities, and he became the most famous theologian of the 20th century as a result of that. So let's give a little of the background of his university life from 1911 to 1915. Now see, this is before the productive days of F.F. Bruce. Moffatt and A.B. Bruce go back to the same time period. 1911 to 1915, Moffatt, by the way, that's double F and double T for his name. Moffatt was a professor of Greek and New Testament exegesis at Mansfield College. Mansfield, just like it sounds. Mansfield College in Oxford. Then from 1915 to 1927, he was professor of church history at the College of the United Free Church in Glasgow. Professor of church history at the College of the United Free Church in Glasgow. But then he's really best known, finally, for his tenure from 1927 to 1939. And of course he dies now 5 years later, so this is really the end of his productive life. 1927 to 1939 as professor of church history at Union Theological Seminary, New York, USA. That's really how he's best known, apart from his translation, but best known in the world is the teaching that he did at Union Theological Seminary from 1927 to 1939 in New York City. So there's a little bit about the man, the author, James Moffatt. Then B, let's come to some of his published works. I said that he was the author of many books. I'm just going to mention a couple of them here. The better known ones, which also happen to be those that are in some sense related to his translation work, which is his best known work. For instance, in 1901, he published his book entitled The Historical New Testament. The Historical New Testament, which did include a translation. This didn't become his famous one, but did include his own translation, as well as some historical background to the New Testament documents. In 1911, another book of his, Introduction to the Literature of the New Testament. 1911, Introduction to the Literature of the New Testament. But then in 1913, his major work, the one that made him famous, was published, and that was The New Testament, a New Translation. 1913. The New Testament, a New Translation. His claim to fame rests squarely on the shoulders of that book. That book more than the complete Bible, or that book more than the Old Testament, because he was a New Testament Greek scholar, not an Old Testament Hebrew one. The New Testament, a new translation, 1913. Then, just to complete the Bible, his Old Testament came out in 1924. And then finally a one-volume revised edition came out in 1928. And that's the date that I've given you. We could give you 1913, or we could give you 1924, but 1928 is the one-volume edition, the Bible, a new translation, which also by Moffatt, which also was revised. That is, the New Testament of 1913, the Old Testament of 1924 in a revised format, a revised edition. And then over the years, it was often revised, again by Moffatt, until its final revision in 1935. And so, for instance, what I have here, it's kind of a modern edition, I'm sure, with all this fancy lettering and coloring. This is a post-1935 edition here. So this is the final edition that Moffatt did himself. Goes through many editions, from the New Testament first being published in 1913 to the whole work in its final revised edition in 1935. And then big letter C in the third place, let's come to the theology, and here's where we'll spend most of our time, the theology of James Moffatt.
Were there other scholars involved in the Old Testament, or was it primarily?
It was primarily by Moffatt. He did have some advisors that helped, like the 20th century New Testament had scholarly advisors that the translators, the anonymous lay translators, could come to for advice. But it was primarily done by Moffatt. It's not impossible to know Hebrew and Greek well enough to translate both, but your translation won't be the best because there's just too much to know in Hebrew and Greek to know both of them so excellently and proficiently that you can give us a good, complete translation. Generally, you're going to have at least two different people or two different groups of scholars involved, some with New Testament and Greek, some with Old and Hebrew. Now, I'm sure all of you, and let me see a show of hands here. And remember, whenever someone takes a poll anywhere, the only way that a poll is any good is that people tell the truth. It doesn't mean that you're any better that you've heard of Moffatt or any worse that you haven't. But the only way I can get a feel for it is to know definitely people to tell the truth. Who has heard of Moffatt's before you heard me say anything about Moffatt? Moffatt's translation. See, that's the only way that I can get a feel for what your background was or something. Well, it's a well-known Bible, and James Moffatt and a lot of people, charismatics and outside of the charismatic movement, have used Moffatt's translation. And from what I can tell of the use of Bible translations, it seems like if you don't use the standards, like an NIV or NASB or KJV or something like that, then it's always, people always kind of take it as a sign of your scholarly inclination or instincts. Well, I don't use any of those. I use Moffatt's Bible, or I use Worrell's translation, or that's a feeling that I pick up from people who carry these things around as their major Bible. This is the one they read from all the time, or if it's a preacher, they preach from, although that would probably be rare. But I think this is especially true in little Bible study groups. I use Moffatt's, or I use Wuest's translation. I mean, this is the original Greek here. I always seem to pick up, maybe I'm wrong, but I seem to pick up a little flavor of pride or arrogancy that I use a specialty translation instead of one of the modern ones that everybody uses, or an ancient one like the KJV. And so I want to spend a lot of time this morning looking at the theology of Moffatt because a whole lot of people, this Bible has sold millions of copies. Many people in America have used Moffatt's translation. Even those who haven't used it as their primary translation have it on their shelf and refer to it every now and then. And I would think that a whole lot of people would be surprised. Maybe we live in such a lukewarm day and age that people don't care if the devil himself translated the Bible, as long as it's the Bible. But I think that people would be surprised if they knew a little of the background of a lot of not only Bible translators, but scholars, period. I mean, we've talked about this when we dealt some with false ministries and things years ago in this church, that if you don't know something about the background of the person, their moral character, where they've come from, then you're probably missing a lot then.
Amen.
Now, I think one theory is, well, it doesn't matter if he's an adulterer and a fornicator, as long as he's a Greek scholar, then all you're dealing with is a Greek text. No, you're dealing with more than a Greek text here. That might work for dealing with the Greek classics, but not the living and breathing Word of God. When you mix an adulterer or a liberal or a neo-orthodox, who is an excellent Greek scholar, by the way, or Hebrew or whatever, with the Bible, I just think the two don't mix, and you're going to have problems on your hands. And so I don't want to fail to point out, and this may kind of become a hobby horse or a constant refrain as we go throughout the rest of our translation work and study here, to listen to what I'm going to have to say about a lot of these translators. I just noticed in an article in the paper yesterday, that little small one, did some of you see that Jimmy Swaggart is under investigation for sexual misconduct by Assemblies of God? It doesn't surprise me at all. I told my wife on the way to church this morning, I said, all these guys are thugs, thieves, liars, adulterers. We just won't find out about all of them. But I'm just convinced they all are, with maybe the exception of Billy Graham. He seems to be about the only one who probably won't be tainted by any of this. But I guess I suspect all of them. I suspect all of them. When you get that type of money and power, you feel invincible then. You say, it doesn't matter if I commit adultery. No one's going to find out about it. And my ministry and the sale of my tapes and the radio and the television production, there's no way that a sin somewhere is going to stop this. They see they've got it all going. It's a machine rolling now. And how is it ever going to stop? But look what happened with the bakers, though. I would suspect old Slick Swaggart, as well as the rest of them. And I suspect a lot of these scholars here. You have to remember that as you pick up some theological book in your library and start reading it, how does he treat his children in the home? What type of marriage does he have? Does he ever get angry at home? You're never going to find that right there in the book. But I'll say that you probably got problems with most of these people. I mean, you see the Christian life is difficult to live. And I would say probably much more difficult when you're these big name, important people. You've got such an image that you've got to maintain. So you just go on in sin and you don't repent. Well, so that's my little introduction on the theology of James Moffatt. You can tell it's going to be pretty bad. A lot of people don't know this, you see, about these people. They just don't know it about these men. So we will be the tattletale on them then. Now, Moffatt's the second big name of Bible translation in this century. Weymouth was the first one, Richard Weymouth. Remember, we're going to have big names, single men who do important work. Richard Weymouth, James Moffatt, Goodspeed, Wuest, Williams. You're going to go through names of heavyweights. Moffatt's our second one. He's an important single name Bible translating work in this century, but his theology fell far short of being biblical or orthodox or conservative in any sense of the term. And the way I'm going to give this to you, his aberrant theology is under 4 points. So we're under, I think, big letter C with theology, and I'll have a 1, 2, 3, 4 underneath this. Just the best way to break it down. I could just go on and talk about Moffatt and just start telling you what I know about Moffatt, and you would just be at wit's end probably trying to write all of it down. So I've tried to organize it. I'd say number 1, first of all, I want to give you a quote that he made in his writings. He once said, I have found, and I quote, freedom from the theory of verbal inspiration, unquote. I have found, quote, freedom from the theory of verbal inspiration. Well, verbal inspiration is not a theory, it's a truth, and it's not something you want to be free from. And the people that I would be most suspicious of are Bible translators who surrender the fact of verbal inspiration. If you're dealing with something else, maybe pastoral ministry or something, where you don't really use the Bible as your text. But after all, if you're translating the Bible, not only is that your text, that's the only thing there is. It's not a commentary where you're using various other sources. It is the Bible that you're translating. And if you have experienced freedom from the theory of verbal inspiration, then I don't know that you're going to treat the text of Scripture with the amount of seriousness that it inherently deserves. After all, this isn't the Word of God. This contains some of the words and some of the thoughts of God, but there are also mistakes by men in here. You see, if you're free from the notion of verbal inspiration, you're not going to treat the Bible with the seriousness that it deserves. He thought this was a great statement of his to make. Well, I finally found freedom from the theory of verbal inspiration. But that's about the same as saying, well, praise God, I finally got deceived by the devil. That's not something to rejoice about, that you found freedom from verbal inspiration. So this would be a serious hindrance for a Bible translator. You don't believe this to be the very Word of God. Then I think that disqualifies you as a translator. Right. You can translate the Greek classics if you want to, because it doesn't matter if you make mistakes there. No one's destiny depends on that. Just go ahead and translate up a storm, but leave the Bible alone. This is the Word of God. Heaven and earth depends on this Word. If you don't believe it's the Word of God, you shouldn't be translating it then. Amen. In his earlier days, you see, he was brought up, A.B. Bruce was a conservative. He had conservative influences earlier in his life. And as he gained age and maturity, and maybe we should say education, then he says, well, I found freedom. You know, at last, it's with this emphasis, at last I found freedom from the theory of verbal inspiration. Well, as I would say, translate the Greek classics if you want to do Greek translating work, but leave the Bible alone. Because at the end of the day, no one cares if you mistranslate the Greek classics. You haven't affected history. You haven't affected anyone's life. Maybe you've done a disservice to one of the ancient Greek writers, but they're in hell. They don't care. There are more important things they're concerned about than the fact that you've mistranslated their work. But when it comes to the Bible, that's another matter. Wait till you hear some of the things I'm going to say about J.B. Phillips. Now, J.B. Phillips' Bible is much more famous than Moffatt's or all of these put together. Everyone's heard of J.B. Phillips' work. Wait till you hear what we'll have to say about that deceived Antichrist soul. And most people don't know it. People in the pew use these Bibles and don't know anything about them in. So there's one thing I would say, that this man does not believe in the theory, the fact, I would say, of verbal inspiration. So that gives him pretty much license to do as he wills with the Bible. Then secondly, a specific comment concerning the Old Testament. Moffatt completely swallowed the higher critical documentary hypothesis of the Pentateuch. He completely swallowed that. I wouldn't even want to say here that he swallowed a baited hook. I mean, the hook was just bare. I mean, he just ate the boat. He wasn't after food or anything. There was no problem with him at all. He completely swallowed the documentary hypothesis of the Pentateuch. Now, you know what that is, that Moses didn't write it. Well, that makes sense if you don't believe in verbal inspiration. That whenever Jesus and the New Testament writers talk about the writings of Moses, and they quote from the Pentateuch, well, you can just say, well, that was accommodation. Jesus was accommodating himself to the, deceptions, the lack of guidance that the early Jews had. They thought that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and so Jesus just played along with them. Well, that just won't work, and it certainly won't work with any correct view of biblical inspiration. Well, that's totally wrong, but it'd be one thing I'd say if you're a Bible translator to hold to that theory, the documentary hypothesis, the JEDP documentary hypothesis theory of the Pentateuch. It'd be one thing to hold to that in your own scholarly opinion. It'd be quite another to incorporate it into a Bible that's intended for the masses. Amen. I mean, if you want to be a scholar and hold to that, that's one thing. To me, you're wrong, but that's one thing. But when you incorporate it into a Bible that's read by the masses, people who don't know the ins and outs, who can't prove or disprove this JEDP business, I mean, lay people don't have the tools to deal with that unless they're just going to believe Jesus, what he said that Moses wrote, and that'd be enough for them, but it's confusing to them. In other words, a discussion or a defense of JEDP theory should be reserved for scholarly texts. That should be for Old Testament introduction books or something, not for a Bible translation read by the masses. But did he incorporate it into the Bible? Well, certainly so. And here's how he did it: by alternating Roman and italic type in the Pentateuch. By alternating the type. For instance, well, let's go back to what we discussed years ago in OT Intro, especially the first couple of chapters of Genesis. Okay, here I have the end of Genesis 1 on this side with Roman type, the first 3 verses of Genesis 2, and then starting with Genesis 2:4, and it's going to have to go all through 2 and 3. Notice, maybe you can't see from that far away, but the type is italic now. He goes from Roman to italic type, back and forth throughout the whole Pentateuch. And of course, what he does up in an extensive introduction to this work is he, gives you the keys on how to read or how to interpret his Bible. And this goes down until you get in chapter, there's a verse in 3, but all the way through 4 until you get to chapter 5. Now it's back to Roman type. And this just back and forth from Genesis all the way through the book of Deuteronomy, swapping back and forth between Roman and italic type. And he also uses these brackets and parentheses. Of course, really you need 4 different types of type for JEDP theory. But basically, really all you need would be the J and the E, the Jehovah and Elohim. Those are the 2 big portions of type. And then when you get over into the priestly code, then you can deal with that in the book of Leviticus. But I think this, again, not only does it show a serious lack of biblical theology for James Moffatt, never falling for this theory and swallowing it, and that's all it is purely a theory by the critics, and a lot of the critics in the late 20th century are giving Julius Wellhausen's theory up now. It just doesn't stand to reason. What it does is just leave the Bible open for anybody's rearrangement. Who's to say whether this was written by the JEDP or P redactor or arranged by this man or that man? Who's to say? Well, it's every man for himself. But that's not as serious, in my opinion, as incorporating this into a Bible that's intended for the masses to read. You're confusing the people with this JEDP theory. Then thirdly, concerning Moffatt's theology, his critical theories told him he had the right to rearrange verses or chapters if he thought they were out of order, to add and to delete words and verses if, in his opinion, they shouldn't be there. That's always his opinion, not on the basis of any type of manuscript evidence. But he felt that he had the right to rearrange verses or the order of entire chapters, sections of Scripture, if, in his personal opinion, he thought they were out of order, to add and to delete words. So you may want to just call this third point rearrangement. Rearrangement of chapters, of sections of Scripture, of words, of sentences. Just rearranged it in whatever order suited him. And I'm going to give you several examples of this. The best known one is the first verse of the Bible, which, by the way, isn't the first verse. It's really the first half of the 4th verse of chapter 2 of Genesis. If you've got Moffatt's and you look, what starts the Bible? Not in the beginning God created, but Genesis 2:4a. This is the story of how the universe was formed. Now he's misread the Toledotes of Genesis, which place these things at the conclusion, generally, to an important section. Here in the first Toledote, specifically so. The others not so much so. Sometimes the others are found halfway between. But Genesis 2:4a becomes the very first verse. Now, some of you on the front rows anyway, I know, can see this. Notice the big black number up there, 2, and then right under it 1. Well, that's 2:4, really 2:4a. And then 1 gives us what we would think of as the first verse of the Bible. There's the best known example, because when you open the Bible and start reading, everyone's familiar with Genesis 1:1, the beginning of the Bible, and instead you've got 2:4a beginning your Bible. Now I'll tell you a little story about this verse also, the rearrangement of this passage. A fellow Scottish minister, a rabidly conservative minister who had attacked Wellhausen's theories of JEDP earlier, whenever he saw Moffatt's Bible, then published a tract. God bless all these pamphleteers that publish tracts to destroy critical work. He published a tract against this placing of Genesis 2:4a first. The name of the tract was The Bible's First Verse, Moses or Moffatt. And that sold many, many copies. Are we going to believe Moses or Moffatt? That was a good tract. And of course he argued against these critical theories that are the undergirding of such actions. They've got these premises they're holding, and they think those premises deserve certain conclusions. So the Bible's first verse, Moses or Moffatt. Then another thing that's rather well known, if you flip over, you want to see this now in your KJV, into the Gospel of John. Now I've come across this not only in Moffatt but several places, but generally you'll see it in commentaries. That's where I've come across it. I don't know that another Bible does this, but I know commentaries rearrange some of those middle chapters in John. Let me see what I want. Okay, John 13:31a. Now let me tell you what I'm going to say, and then we'll look at it here. A lot of commentators feel that John chapters 15 and 16, that John chapters 15 and 16 are out of order. That logically they should go after John 13:31. Maybe I can even diagram it and you'll understand it a little better. Let's say here we've got John, and really it's 13:31a. We won't get too complicated in our diagram, but John 13:31, then after that comes John 15, John 16, John 13:32 to the end of that chapter, John 14, John 17, and on. Okay, you see that? 13:31, then you stick in 15 and 16, 2 whole chapters. He's pulled chapters out of their context and rearranged them. Then 13:32, you follow the narrative back out, 14. Now you got to skip 15 and 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. The end of John's Gospel. Now why do they do this? Well, a lot of people say that logically it makes better sense. Logically it makes better sense to rearrange the chapters. Well, there are some reasons why logically it may make better sense, but there are other reasons why it may not. So what we want to do then is go to the manuscripts and see, now, do we have a corruption in the manuscripts? And no manuscripts support this. No manuscript families, old or new, corrupt or uncorrupt, none of them support this. This is purely a critical theory. Now, if you had your KJV open to John 13:31, let's read it and see if you can catch the flavor of the logic why they think that it ought to be in this order. But you'll read many commentaries on the Gospel of John that will say this is the way that it should be. And the conservative ones that you read probably won't follow this way, but they'll say that this is a critical theory, and they'll certainly alert you to the fact that chapters 15 and 16 were somehow placed out of order, somewhere back in manuscript tradition. Okay, we're in John 13, and Judas has just left. Verse 30, Judas went out immediately. Now I'm reading from Moffatt's translation, so mine may not read like yours. But verse 30, so Judas went out immediately after taking the bread, and it was night. And Moffatt has a new paragraph with 31. When he had gone out, Jesus said, now you need to skip to 15:1, I am the real vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. And then he goes right into that. When he had gone out, 13:31, Jesus said, and then in Moffatt, what I have next, you see, at the end of verse 31 is chapter 15. And then he gives you a star here, and it says chapters 15 and 16 are restored to their original position in the middle of verse 31. Well, that's purely hypothesis. What do you mean they've been restored to their original? Give us proof that that was their original position. Well, there's no proof. Purely a critical theory. And then we have to get over to the end of chapter 16. Let's read 16:33. You see, we'll be at the end of 16, then we're going to pick back up with really 13:31b. It splits up that verse in the middle. So we'll read the end of 16. I have said all this to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you have trouble, but courage. I have conquered the world. Now, at last the Son of Man is glorified, and in him God is glorified. I'm back to 13:31b and following. If God is glorified in him, God will glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. You see, their notion is, how could Jesus, after Judas left, and Jesus more or less predicted the betrayer, although the apostolic band didn't catch on, how could he then go into talking about how, well, now I'm glorified. Now you're glorified. Now you're crucified. You've just sealed your own doom now by sending out this man into the dark night. Now I'm crucified. He's saying now I'm glorified. And so that makes better sense after you go through 15 and 16 and talk about the sending of the Spirit, which would imply the ascension of Christ. Now I am glorified. Well, you know, maybe that makes better sense, but who's to say, though? I mean, I can see how he's glorified in what leads up to what we call in theology the glorification of Christ, which is the betrayal by the apostate Judas Iscariot and the crucifixion. That this is a prelude to the glorification. So that's purely a critical theory that has no support anywhere, and yet it's right in Moffatt's Bible. He doesn't just stick down in a footnote and suggest that the reader do this for himself. He does it for you in the arrangement of the order. And then in the footnotes, he has the presumption to say, now I have restored this to the original order. Fact of the matter is, that is not the original order. We'll show you some other time. It makes much better sense to just keep it in the order that it's in every Bible and every manuscript except James Moffatt's, and that is 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. Makes much better sense that way. So there are the two best-known places. The others I'm going to give you are not as well known, but those are the two best-known places where his critical presuppositions cause him to rearrange, first of all, a verse, Genesis 2:4a, so you're stuck with the question, is it going to be Moses or Moffatt? And then whole chapters, whole sections of Scripture in John 13 through 17. And then let's go on and cover some more that are not as well known. 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter 3:19. Now this happens to be one of the difficult passages in Scripture to interpret. I believe I know what the interpretation of this section is, so I say difficult, not because the answer is not easy to see if you'll just take it, but because so many people have so many opposing answers to explain what's going on here at the end of 1 Peter 3. The so-called Jesus preaching to the spirits in prison section. You've got, well, I need to open my KJV so I can read all of it together. 1 Peter 3, and we have to skip up to 18. By which Christ also once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh. And here's what I need to end of this, but quickened by the Spirit. This is one of the JDS passages also. They say, that he was dead spiritually, and so he was quickened by the Spirit. Quickened by the Spirit, the KJV then leads into verse 19 with that ending phrase, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison. Now, they just give us the pronoun he in verse 19. Well, we would assume Christ, verse 18, is the one who went and preached unto the spirits in prison, whatever that verse means. In some people's mind, they can't really come up with what it means. Which sometime are disobedient, when once the long-suffering of God waited in the days of Noah. That's the problem in the passage. How can, we've got Christ preaching to the spirits in prison. First of all, we don't know what type of preaching he means. Is it a proclamation of victory? Is it a second offer of salvation? Because these people before the cross didn't get to hear the message. You got all types of theories. And then what in the world is this connection between Jesus preaching to the spirits in prison and people who disobeyed in Noah's day? How about the people who disobeyed in David's day and Zechariah's day? Why is it that just those people deserved to hear the message again or for the first time or to hear something proclaimed? So it's rather confusing. But anyway, part of the confusion is taken out with Moffatt's translation. 1 Peter 3:19, it was in the Spirit that Enoch also went and preached to the imprisoned spirits. Enoch? Wait a minute now. Where was Enoch here in this passage? That's over in Jude, I think, but I'm in 1 Peter 3. Well, it's purely his notion. It fits the context better because Enoch lived back in that general time period. Jesus didn't. And so Enoch was preaching to people. He was a preacher like Noah was in his day. And he has a footnote that he's following an emendation. Now, an emendation is just a big word for nothing. Emendation, they're often called critical emendations. An emendation just means this is a pure theory. It's a hypothesis. I'm amending it according to my own premise that I have. He's following one of Rendell Harris. Rendell Harris was all confused about a lot of things. In Noakes, which has been omitted after some Greek words by a scribe's blunder and dropping some repeated letters, the story of this mission is told in the book of Enoch, says my footnote. So he's found something in an extra biblical work, the book of Enoch, and he thinks that not only that, but a similar Greek phrase here can help explain why Enoch was dropped, and the scribes didn't know what to put in, so they just left a pronoun he. Left it up to you to interpret. We would all take the he to refer back to verse 18, to refer to Christ. Fact of the matter is, that's a pure lie. I won't even say a hypothesis. It's a lie. The passage is speaking of Christ and the Holy Spirit and not Enoch. 1 Timothy 5:23. 1 Timothy 5:23, which he calls 1 Timotheus. He gives Timothy the full name. Now, 1 Timothy 5:23 is that difficult passage about drinking wine for thy... Don't only drink water, but drink wine for thy often infirmities, for thy stomach's sake. So that's been kind of a thorn for commentators ever since it was penned, I suppose, except for Timothy. I'm sure he knew what it meant. But everybody since then, well, what exactly is meant here? How is that going to help? And why is Timothy sick? And so Moffatt takes care of that. I've got in my Bible, verse 22, and I'm going to read it in order to the end of the chapter. Moffatt, 1 Timothy 5:22, never be in a hurry to ordain a presbyter. Do not make yourself responsible for the sins of another man. Keep your own life pure. Some people's sins are notorious and call for judgment. But in some cases, sin only comes out afterwards. Did you notice what happened? He just skips it. Just throws it out. And he puts it down in a footnote, the words, give up being a total abstainer, take a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent attacks of illness which follow, are either a marginal gloss or misplaced. He doesn't know which. But he just takes them out. So you don't have to deal with interpreting them. And a final reference back to the Old Testament. You don't really need to turn here. 1 Samuel 14:11. This is the chapter where Jonathan and his armor bearer go up against the Philistines. And the Philistines, remember, look down. They're up on a rock, and they look down and they say, well, look, the Hebrews are coming out of holes in the ground. Well, all it takes is one change of a letter, and you go in the Hebrew language from Hebrew to mouse, or from Hebrews to mice. All it takes is striking out one letter, or changing one letter. And so, of course, his has, behold, the mice are coming out of the ground. That's not a serious problem, because, maybe we could think that the Philistines are simply referring to the Hebrews under this derogatory term. But the mice are coming out of the ground. And a few Old Testament commentators say that maybe that was the original reading, but we don't have any manuscript support of that. The manuscripts give us Hebrews. The Hebrews are coming out of the ground, coming out of holes in the ground, and not the mice. 1 Samuel 14:11. And then in the fourth place, still under his theology, I'm giving you a quote of his, then the documentary hypothesis, then rearrangement. The fourth place, I would entitle this Naked Pure Liberalism, especially in Christological passages. Here's where we have our most serious problems. Naked Pure Liberalism. He doesn't even try to hide anything. This is seen in numerous places in Moffatt's, but liberalism is most dangerous in areas of Christology, as well as in areas of inspiration, I guess I could say. Because if you tamper with the doctrine of Christ, John tells us, then that man has not God. If you don't have the Son, you don't have the Father. And don't receive that one into your house. That'd be a dangerous area to tamper with, but that's the first thing the liberals go after. And the first thing they go after in Christological areas is what? Not his resurrection or virgin birth, his deity. That's the first area you attack as a liberal. Or it may be the last one because you're wanting to come in the back door to get to it. But it's still the major one. You're wanting to deal with his deity. Does Moffatt believe in the deity of Christ? Well, no. He doesn't believe in the inspiration of Scripture. He doesn't believe Moses wrote the Pentateuch. I doubt many of you knew this about James Moffatt's translation. He doesn't believe Jesus is the Son of God. I'm not going to follow a man like that. I don't care what type of Greek scholar or Swahili scholar he is. I'm not going to follow a man, especially not follow his Bible. You hear people quoting from Moffatt as though he's a final authority. He's a final authority on liberalism, maybe. Not a final authority on what God says in the Word of God. So let me give you some examples of this deceived soul. How about John 1? All you got to do is turn to the important Christological passages, and he tampers with all of them. I'm going to start with the best one, the biggest one here. I generally start and work my way up, and I'm coming through the back door like they do sometimes. So I'll start at the front door, John 1. Now, he does fine. In my opinion, this is the thing to do. Don't translate the Greek, just give it to us. The Logos existed in the very beginning. In the beginning was the Word, the KJV says. My opinion would be you ought to just leave the Greek there and then put in a footnote for the person, the lay person, is involve yourself in Bible study and try to learn what the word means. Because when you translate it word or revelation or unveiling or whatever, you've missed what John had said. I don't know any way to translate Logos in John 1:1 except Logos. I don't know any way to say it but Logos. That's my own opinion, and I think that's the biblical view. Other places where Logos appears, it's fine to translate it word, but not here in John 1. It's just too big, too comprehensive of a term to translate it as word. In the beginning was the Logos. The Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Okay, Moffatt's Genesis, I'm still in Genesis, John 1:1. The Logos existed in the very beginning. Now you might not catch this. The Logos was with God. The Logos was divine. It's that last phrase there. Divine? Well, that's an ambiguous term there. Bette Midler's called divine. The divine Miss M. Divine is an ambiguous term. The Logos existed in the very beginning. The Logos was God. The Logos was divine. See, that's not what the Greek says. The Greek says it's the same term for God in the second part of that verse. The Logos was with God, theos. The Logos was God, theos. You don't have another term now for divine. See, what you could get out of this is that he's not God, but he's somehow above humanity. And that's exactly what Moffatt is intending here. That's a very important verse in the Bible. Everyone knows John 1:1, and he does not ascribe deity to the Son. He's simply divine. Now, I know sometimes we use divine to mean deity, but really they're not the same terms. Divinity and deity are two different terms entirely. divinity and deity. Sometimes we use divinity loosely to refer to deity. But that thing you eat you don't call deity, do you? You call it divinity because it tastes heavenly. But it's not heaven, though. It's not God. It just tastes like it came from that realm. And as I say, many people are referred to as divine this or divine that. Bette Midler is one. But people don't call her God, just the divine Miss Sim. So there's the best known place. Pure liberalism in Christological areas. Let me just mention some others. Think of where are the other, maybe we should test your Bible knowledge real quickly here. We always use these occasions to test your knowledge. What are some other Christological passages in the New Testament? The important ones, the weighty ones. Okay, that's not dealt with here. That's an important one. Where else? Christological passages. I'm thinking of the epistles. Doctrinal teaching on the person of Christ. Hebrews 1. All right, we're going to look at that. Okay, that's not dealt with here. Well, there's so many. Maybe that's not a fair test. Philippians 2, verses 5 to 8. The kenosis passage. Let's see what Moffatt has. I don't know that I want to take the time to read all of these. Philippians 2, you see, that's a well-known. Besides John 1, that's probably the most famous Christological passage in the Bible. Philippians 2. Just so-called kenosis because of the Greek word here. Okay, doesn't the KJV in verse 6 have the form of God, being in the form of God? Well, Moffatt has, though he was divine by nature, he did not set store upon equality with God, but emptied himself by taking the nature of a servant. That may not appear like much to you, but when you get into a deeper study of the Greek terms and the doctrine of the Trinity and hypostasis and ousia and one ousia and three hypostases and what all the Chalcedonian writers and fathers had to say, you'll see that this is a serious problem to not ascribe the form of God to Jesus Christ and simply say of him, though he was divine by nature. We have a problem not only with the term divine and not only with the term nature. That's a fairly good term, that he was divine by nature. It didn't happen at his baptism or something, but by nature. But when you leave out that he was in the form of God, then you've lost something Christologically speaking. Colossians 1, 15 to 18 is another important Christological section. The so-called preeminence passage, that he must have the preeminence, Colossians 1, 15 to 18. And then Hebrews 1, 3, which one of you did say, I would like to turn to this. Hebrews 1, 3, which I believe in the KJV says something along this line, who being the brightness of God's glory and the express image of his person. Who being the brightness of God's glory and the express image of his person. Hypostasis. The express image of his ousia, his essence, his substance. Well, here's what Moffatt has. He, reflecting God's bright glory, that's fair enough, that he's a reflection of God. But listen to the second part, and stamped with God's own character. Stamped with God's own character. Well, I think in one sense, we as Christians are stamped with God's character. We become partakers of the divine nature, 2 Peter chapter 1. The express image of his hypostasis, of his essence, of his substance. Moffatt has stamped with God's own character. So in places where he can tamper with the doctrine of Christ, he does. And then let me give you one other, and we're going to see this again, so you want to remember this one. We're going to see this one again in Bible translating work, is over in Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy. Matthew chapter 1, verses, well, I guess I just need 16. Now, let me just diagram this also. I think it will help explain. Well, in the KJV, you have your begats, that someone begat someone, and here he has that someone was the father of someone. But anyway, we just got this man was the father of this man, who was the father, too many M's, of this man, who was the father of this man. And on occasions, we have that this man was the father of this man by this woman. You go back in the earlier part of the genealogy, 4 or 5, somewhere along there. Yeah, like 5. Nahshon, the father of Solomon. Solomon, the father of Boaz by Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth. David was the father of Solomon by Uriah. You have a couple of women brought in with this term, by, that this man begat this man by her. Most of the time the women are left out. Just this man begat, begat, begat. Now, of course, we know when we get down to the end, we've got 2 people we're dealing with, Joseph and Mary. I need to turn to mine so I don't get it wrong when I try to tell you what I want to tell you here. Yeah, this is in verse 16. Jacob begat Joseph. Now for the first time we have this phrase, the husband of Mary. And then we've got the birth of Jesus. Let me give you Moffatt's first. Moffatt says, Jacob, the father of Joseph, and Joseph, to whom the Virgin Mary was betrothed, that's in parenthesis, by the way, the father of Jesus, who is called Christ. You've got Jacob, then you've got Joseph, then you've got in parentheses, this business about Mary. All of that's in parentheses, that he was the husband of Mary, the father of Christ. Well, you see, that is also heresy in the Christological area, because the Bible never says, now some of the Jewish people said it, and the Bible simply reports their words, but the Bible never says that Joseph is the father of Jesus. You're denying the virgin birth then, although in the parenthesis you've called her the Virgin Mary. She was a virgin before Joseph had relations with her, which produced Jesus. You can still get around that. She was a virgin to start with. Well, so what? All women were at one time. You haven't said anything about the birth of this child Jesus, so whenever you say that Joseph was the father of Jesus. Now, as I say, the New Testament in the Gospels does say that Joseph was his father, only when reporting that's what Jews were saying, but it never claims that of itself. As a matter of fact, if you look in your KJV, and here's a little tidbit that you can glean from the Greek and not from the English, here's what we have. It teaches virgin birth, by the way, Matthew 1:16. Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, comma, of whom? Now, to whom does the whom refer? Joseph or Mary? Whom is feminine in Greek, not masculine. If we know its gender, it has to refer to Mary. All we're told here is that Jesus was born of Mary. Nothing is said of Joseph. Nothing is said of Joseph at all, except that he was the husband of Mary. That's very important to know. To whom does the whom refer? It's feminine in gender. It can only refer to Mary. So you've got Joseph married to Mary, and then Christ came of Mary, not of Joseph. You say, well, you could say that in the sense that she gave birth. Well, no, the whole chapter has been showing this man came from that man, came from that man, came from that man, came from that M-A-N, who was married to Mary, and this child came from her. I mean, that's the emphasis of the chapter, showing that this son was born of that man until you get to the last one, and you say this son was born of that woman. And you don't make any comment about the father. You see, Matthew intends for us to catch that. That's why the genealogy is important, among other reasons. Every time it's a father begat a son, until you get to Mary, until you get to Joseph, and then all it says is Joseph is married to this woman Mary, and now it's no longer a father begetting a son, but a woman, virgin birth. And so what does he do? He throws in the term father, without even giving us a footnote. By the way, that is found in some of the manuscripts that obviously are inferior. He follows an inferior variant and doesn't even give you a note, not in mine anyway, as to that fact. You know, after looking at all of this, this Christological heresy, calling Jesus divine, denying deity to him by implication, and I'd wonder how he'd translate 2 John. I'd wonder how he'd translate 2 John. I think I'm going to go take a look at that. 2 John, verse 9, anyone who is, quote, advanced, unquote, and will not remain by the doctrine of Christ does not possess God. He who remains by the doctrine of Christ possesses both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this doctrine, do not admit his Bible into your house. Do not even greet him, for he who greets him shares in his wicked work. Pretty good translation, pretty poor practice of that translation. Good translation. If you deny the doctrine of Christ, you are a heretic. Don't receive that one into your house. And untold multitudes have opened their arms and received Moffatt into their house. Into their heart is their reliable Bible translator that they follow. Well, I'd say 2 John 9 to 11 is a good translation, but a very poor practice of it in those other passages.